Hello again, wonderful teachers. This is Becky Brown, Director of the North State Arts Education Consortium. And we've decided that's too hard to say, so we're calling it NSEEK. So welcome back, NSEEKers. I'm really excited because we are focusing on summative assessment for Module 2, and we're thinking about jumping all the way to the end of those lesson plans that you're developing and focusing on the summative assessment. And the reason we're doing that is because it's important to think about at the end of a lesson or a unit, what are those things that you really want your students to know and be able to do? And then in our final module, we'll be talking about those strategies and activities and steps that you're going to be using to take your students there. So for this module, we are asking ourselves, what does quality arts education assessment look like? And before we jump into that, I think it's important to confront the myths around arts education assessment, because I think there are a lot of them out there. The first one is that all art is subjective, and so it's difficult to assess. And we know that as arts educators, that all art forms have a set of criteria by which they can be judged and measured. So those arts assessments are not subjective. They do have an objective set of criteria that your students can aim for as artists. The second myth is that it's all about the end product. So some people tend to think about art in the classroom as being about, that art gallery that you're going to put up right before back to school night for parents in your classroom, or it's all about that band concert at the end of the year, or that theater production that your students have worked so hard on. But we know, again, as arts educators, there are a lot of benchmarks and progress points along the way before you get to that end product. So it's important to check in at those points as well. And finally, a lot of people think that assessment is contradictory to the artistic process. And in other words, if you give your students tests and exams and assess them in an arts classroom, it's going to somehow squash their creativity and their imagination. But again, we know that's not really true, and that it's important to assess your students so that you can communicate progress toward your learning goals for them along the way. So we're knocking out those myths right away before we jump into thinking about what your final assessment is going to look like. So arts assessment should really take into account these three elements of arts learning. The first is that knowledge, that content knowledge that you're passing along to your students. The second is process. So what are the steps to attaining the learning goals in the classroom? And finally, production. So those products that your students are creating as musicians and sculptors and artists in your classroom. So let's define our terms. First of all, some people get summative and formative assessment a little mixed up, and they are kind of nebulous. They do overlap at sometimes, but formative assessment at a basic level, those are those really in-process check-ins, those evaluations of student comprehension, learning needs, and academic progress that happen during a lesson, unit, or course. So it's really checking in with your students' progress along the way, so you can take more time on a concept, or you can rethink how you're teaching before they get to that final assessment. So summative assessment comes at the end of an instructional period, so a lesson or a unit, and it's used to evaluate student learning, skill acquisition, and academic achievement. That comes at the conclusion of a unit or a lesson. So summative assessment is what we're focusing on for Module 2. I like this quote from Paul Black. He's one of the big assessment gurus. He says, when the cook tastes the soup, that's formative assessment. So you can go back in and you can add a little salt or pepper. When the customer tastes the soup, that's summative assessment. So that's what happens at the end of a learning period. So let's talk a little bit about quality arts education assessment. So what should it look like in your classroom? And some things to think about that have been suggested by the Sesesa Arts Initiative. There should be, in a summative assessment, an insistence on excellence. And we know this is true, that when we are held to high standards, it really motivates us, and it really motivates your students to do better. And that, yes, you're supporting them along the way, but you really want to communicate high standards to all students in your class. There is an importance of self-assessment and peer assessment. So that should be happening at times in your class, because we know, and research tells us, that when we give students a grade, the learning stops. So they sort of feel like, okay, I've arrived. But self-assessment can really engage them in taking ownership of their own learning. Quality arts assessment should have multiple forms of assessment. So, for example, if I'm a ceramics teacher, I don't want to just assess what's coming out of the kiln or that final product. I want to give my students lots of opportunities to engage in writing assessments, maybe even the vocabulary quiz, so I know that they're learning the lingo of the trade. That's going to give me a much broader understanding of what students are learning in my class, instead of just waiting until that pot comes out of the kiln. So engaging in multiple forms of assessment is important. And finally, assessment should be ongoing. Again, shouldn't just be that final band concert at the end of the year, because ongoing assessment and those consistent check-ins with what your students are learning really communicate to students that the process is important too, that it's important as artists and sculptors and musicians and actors and dancers that you continue to try and you continue to challenge yourself, and you might fail along the way at times, but you just keep going, and that process is important too. So in the next section, in Module 2, we're going to give you really concrete tools and strategies for developing your summative assessment, and give you lots of time to explore some websites so you get good ideas for your classroom. So thanks for hanging in there, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye.